this assignment, you were given some information about an assembly line that is assembling watches that has 5 workstations in it that are balanced, completely balanced, and that has a certain production rate, an intended production rate that it's supposed to produce. And you were asked some questions about what is the implied cost based on if it works as intended, and if it doesn't work as intended, if there is a shortfall, what is the additional cost? And you were asked about what are some of the things that you would have had to assume would be some things that you necessarily had to make assumptions about in order to answer these questions. So let's take a look at the cost without having any issues with this particular process. So there were 5 workstations. That doesn't matter for this particular question because they're balanced workstations. So 300 units being produced in 7 hours. And therefore the cycle time per unit. First, you can think of it as the processing time. The processing time per unit at each workstation would have been 7 times 60 minutes, 420, divided by 300 gives us 1.4 minutes. Now, why do we say processing time equals cycle time? Because at each workstation, there was only one resource, one person or one machine that was working, and therefore processing time equals the cycle time. So the cycle time of each of the stations, the processing time of each of the stations is 1.4 minutes, and then the cycle time of the process. If you're standing at the end of the process, you're getting an assembled watch every 1.4 minutes. And that's given that they're producing at their intended rate of 300 units per day, right? So 1.4 minutes at each workstation and for the process. Balanced line, therefore that's the case. Now, what would be the labor cost based on this? There were 5 workers that were working 7 hours. So you multiply 5 times 7, that gives you your 35 work hours, 35 person hours, $15 an hour gives you 525 per day. Intended production of 300 watches, so 525 divided by 300 gives you an assembly cost of 1.75. So the labor cost is 1.75 per unit based on 5 workstations and a production of 300. Now, the next part of the assignment asked you about there being a shortfall. So there's a 90% shortfall in the production, and this can be taken in 2 different ways based on 2 different assumptions that you can make about this. So let's start with one viewpoint, and then we'll get to the second viewpoint. So first, if you think about it in terms of 90% of production was achieved, right? In the 7 hours, 90% of production was achieved. So in the 7 hours, there were 270 watches that were assembled. So what would be the additional time that would be required for making that shortfall? So they have a demand of 300 units. They fell short by 10%, so they made only 270. For the balance 30 watches, you need 1.4 minutes per watch, and that gives you 30 times 1.4, 42 minutes. So you need 42 minutes per watch, and you remember there were 5 workstations, so you would have to take the 42 minutes at each of those 5 workstations if you were thinking of the cost, the total additional cost that you would need to calculate in terms of overtime, right? Now, this needs certain assumptions, and we'll talk about the assumptions later. Let's take the alternative perspective, right? So first we said they needed 90 minutes. But if you say that there were 270 watches produced in 7 hours, the cycle time would work out to 7 times 60, which is still 420 minutes divided by 270 gives you a cycle time of 1.56 minutes. So if you take this perspective, what are we saying? We're saying that the 30 watches and 1.56 minutes per watch, the additional time required would be 46.8. What's the difference between this and the previous perspective? In the previous perspective, we said that they were producing still at the rate of each watch was being produced at the rate of 1 every 1.4, and here we're saying that each watch is being produced at 1 watch requiring 1.56 because they're simply working at 90% of the efficiency throughout the time, right? So it requires 46.8 minutes for the additional watches to be manufactured. And again, we're going to talk about the assumptions in a little bit, but let's take this alternative perspective, and you may have gone through it through a different calculation, slightly different calculation, but getting at the same result. So this perspective says that 90% equals 7 hours. So you worked at 90%, that 90% gives you 7 hours. So what is 100%? That would be 7.78 hours. So you would need an extra 0.78 hours to accomplish that production, and that would again come back to 46.8 minutes, which I'll go back to the previous slide that we had over here to look at the previous calculation. It gave us exactly the same number, which is 46.8 minutes. So you must already be thinking about the difference between the assumption that we're making here versus the assumption that we made in the previous perspective, where we said that it takes 42 extra minutes. Now we're saying 46.8, right? So, so this different calculation gives you 46.8 minutes. All right, talking about the labor cost, this is simply taking the idea that every additional minute is going to cost you at the rate of 22.50 per hour. So if you took perspective 1, you said that it takes 42 minutes. There were 5 people working, so 42 divided by 60 converts it into minutes, 5 workers, and then you multiply by 22.50 because that's the overtime rate. It's 50% more than the usual rate of $15, so it's $22.50, and that gives us $78.75 additional cost for the day. So original cost of paying the employees for the full 7 hours is $525. You add the $78.75, and that gives you the total cost for 300 units. So a per unit cost of $2.01, 0.0125, right? So $2.01. Taking the second perspective, if you remember, we talked about some additional time with the second perspective. So it wasn't quite 42 minutes, it was 46.8 minutes, and there we're saying that 46.8 divided by 60, converting the 46.8 into hours, and then multiplying that by 22.50 and 5 workers. So that gives us 87.75, a little bit higher than the first perspective. Total cost of $525 plus 87.75 for 300 units gives us $2.04. So a 3-cent difference between perspective 1 and perspective 2. Now, let's go back to the idea of the assumptions, right? So we said we had made some assumptions and we didn't talk about it earlier. So let's go to that idea and see what those assumptions would be. And pretty much, you would have pretty much guessed what the assumptions were for the 2 perspectives. For the first one, we were assuming that when there is overtime, they are working at 100%, right? So they're not going to continue to work at that shortfall at which they were working earlier. So they're working at 100% during the overtime. In the second perspective, what you would have implied if you did the calculation that way is you would have said that when they work extra, they continue to work at that 90% rate. So that would be the assumption. One of these 2 assumptions would be relevant based on what calculations that you would have come up with. The second assumption that you may or may not have thought about is that the line stoppage is to the same extent, that the balance that we had in the line continued during overtime, and that the line stoppage was also the same extent in terms of the balance. So the line stopped equally for everyone who is working in that assembly line. So that's why it was spread equally across the 5, and it was spread equally across the 5 in the overtime as well. So this is another assumption that you may have thought of, and you were asked to think of at least one assumption. So either one of these, if you would have thought of, would be adequate. But technically speaking, you would have to assume both of these things for these calculations to work out.